Go
All
ahead, Lisa.
right. So thank you, Rajiv. It's good to be with all of you. I'm Lisa Morgan once again. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the Ross Alumni Career Coach. Really excited to be here today. Love Austin. So it's nice to have the Austin Club sponsoring today. So my role with alumni is really to support you at every phase of job search. Everything from who am I, what do I want to be when I grow up, right? So that self-assessment and soul searching, all the way to how do I update my resume in LinkedIn? Um, how should I handle networking, job search strategy, and then finally, what do I need to do to prepare to interview and negotiate? So everything, like I say, from soup to nuts and in between. So just a little bit about my background. I hail from the great state of Michigan, born and raised. I actually went to the Michigan Business School back in the day before it was Ross. I earned my BBA and started my career. I hired in through on-campus recruiting and started my career in IT consulting. And there I am over in the right-hand corner, falling asleep over my keyboard. Pretty quickly discovered that that wasn't the career for me, which some of you may have gone through this too. And went through my own career journey of soul searching and self-discovery, and ultimately zigzag my way over into becoming a career coach and leadership coach, which is what I do today for Ross. So love what I do. And my greatest wish for all of you is that you love what you do too. So there on the bottom, you can see my family, my husband and 2 kids. And yes, if you're looking closely, you'll notice that my son is wearing a Michigan State t-shirt. So breaks my heart every day that the money is flowing in from the Wolverines and flowing out to the Spartans. But we all have our cross to bear, right? So finally, in the right-hand corner, there is my dog, Ziggy, who at 10 pounds looks really cute, but his nickname in the neighborhood is Killer. So that tells you a little bit about him. You don't want to mess with Ziggy. All right, so our topic for tonight is job searching in the current climate. And before we jump into that, I want to make sure that you're all clear on what career services are available to you as alums. To begin with, the one-on-one career coaching with me, which I talked about earlier. This is a phenomenal benefit that you have as Ross alumni for life. And at this point, we haven't had to cap it. Over the last 2 years, each of the last 2 years, I've conducted about 700 to 750 appointments with Ross alumni. So really good sample size, really good exposure in terms of what's happening in the market. So that's what's going to allow me to speak to the current climate. But it's a wonderful resource, and I just want to make sure that you're all taking full advantage of that. Now, besides that, if you go to our website, which is really easy to find, you just Google Ross Alumni Career Resources and it'll pop right up. We have a step-by-step career management guide. So if you want to just do a self-guided tour through career transition, you can do that on our website. Besides that, we have career webinars out there, a variety of recorded career webinars. We may put this one out there as well. For instance, though, we've got Jeremy Schiffling, who does phenomenal work in breaking into tech. So we've had Jeremy come and speak to us a couple of times, and that's out there. Jeremy is a Ross alum and really an expert on breaking into tech. So we've featured him a number of times. We also have an alumni job board. This is the same job board that our students have access to, but it includes job postings that companies have specifically said that they want alumni to see. So that's out there too. The alumni directory is there, which I'm sure you all have used in the past. That's great for getting email addresses for alumni who you want to potentially reach out to. And even, I would say better than that, is the LinkedIn, our Ross LinkedIn alumni search page. So this is not the LinkedIn group for alumni, but it's actually the Ross School page that has an alumni button you can click on, and it has some really phenomenal search capability. So if you haven't used that already and you want me to guide you through it, feel free to set up an appointment with me. I'm happy to do that. I do that with virtually everybody. I show them how to use that tool. And finally, you still have access to Kresge company research databases. For instance, if you want to generate a list of target companies, which is so important in job search, right? Having that list of targets, you can use the D&B Hoover's database, enter industry information, zip code, information and company size information and generate a really nice list of target companies and then drill into each of those companies. So that's what's involved in Ross Alumni Career Resources. So now getting a little bit into our topic for this evening, Ross alumni and the job market. I would say overall, it's been a really phenomenal job market, since 2021, easily, even with the pandemic. Ross alumni did really well. I'm talking to hundreds of people, every year. And sure, there are a few people who are struggling, and I'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that. And if you're one of those people, I definitely want to hear from you, and let's make sure that we're collaborating. But overall, it's been super positive. I pulled some of this information here from our employment report from last year. So starting over on the left-hand side, our MBAs, 98% of them received job markets or job offers within the first 3 months of graduation. For the handful of people who didn't, the folks I worked with, they did really well even after that. So it was super positive. 94% of our graduates are career switchers. So the message there is, if you want to switch careers, get a master's degree like an MBA. But big asterisk, do it when you're in your 20s or early 30s, because after that time, an advanced degree doesn't necessarily make a pivot easy. So that's something that, if you want to chat about that further, I'm happy to talk about it offline. But it's one of the important things related to what I call kind of like structural age discrimination, that as you get more advanced in your career, it gets harder to pivot. Okay. So the other thing I would want to point out here is that 60% of our graduates on the MBA side went into tech or consulting. And on the BBA side, it was mainly consulting and finance. Our MBAs had phenomenal starting salary package offers of an average of $171,000. Now that included also signing bonuses. The base salary alone was about $144,000. So super. Gosh, that's a heck of a lot better than I did when I graduated from the Michigan Business School, let me tell you. So you've got a list of companies over there to the right that a lot of MBAs joined, and then to the far right, a lot of BBAs joined. And then we've got that $84,000, which was the mean salary package for BBAs. Again, phenomenal. That included signing bonuses too. Okay, so I'm going to keep plunging ahead. And we'll take questions in just a little while. So let's talk about what happened during the pandemic and kind of bring it up to the present. You can see here with these graphs, obviously, you can see the shock waves hitting the market, the shock and the recovery. The top graph is unemployment. The bottom graph is the stock market. And it was tough for a little while there, mainly because of the uncertainty. In the early weeks and months, there were hiring freezes and layoffs, especially in entertainment, travel, and hospitality, the restaurant industry. But many of our Ross alumni weren't affected by that at all. Folks in tech, et cetera, did actually really well. Any of those companies that were involved in keeping us at home and productive during the pandemic did exceptionally well. For our new grads, however, because I think a lot of companies, the consulting companies, the banks and so forth, were unsure, there was a lot of uncertainty. There were start date delays, first until fall, then until winter, then until spring. And some of the smaller companies actually pulled offers. So there was some tough times in there. But what was so surprising, and I'm sure what you all will agree with me on, is how quickly business adapted. It was really unprecedented and amazing. And because business adapted, what happened was it was business as usual for many companies, and they kept using consultants, right? They kept starting loans with banks. So the consulting firms and the banks, for instance, were kind of caught, on the back of their heels after they had frozen hiring, laid people off, and that sort of thing. And they had to very quickly hire. So beginning in about early 2021 and heading into summer, there's, I saw what I would call this hiring frenzy of, the consulting firms, the banks and other industries, tech, really hiring like crazy. And it's funny because in the summer of 2021, I realized I was doing all interviewing and negotiating meetings with people, which was phenomenal. Never seen anything like it in my 15 years of doing this work. Some other trends I think I would mention at this point were people, women leaving the workforce, right? We've heard about that, especially women, because they had to homeschool and try to work at the same time. People retiring early. So again, this all impacted the sort of the imbalance between job seekers who then had more power in the market versus hiring companies. I also, though, saw people staying in companies, sort of the I'm glad I have a job group during the pandemic. So people kind of hunker down. Well, I'm really glad I have a job. I'm not going to rock the boat right now. And frankly, working from home became a game changer for people. Just being able to be at home with the kids, get them off the bus, the ability to work from anywhere. We saw people going to Mexico, flying all over the country, getting Airbnbs. And so it just unleashed this freedom that we haven't had before. Now it's getting to the point where people are expecting that, right? I want that flexibility. I want to, be able to work remotely. I want to be able to work in a hybrid situation. And so companies that aren't offering that are going to generally be at a disadvantage going forward. So I'll talk about that. The other thing I would want to mention, and some of you may have felt this, is early career people, like our new grads, maybe from the BBA program or from the MBA, who didn't have those social networks at their new companies, feeling very disconnected during the pandemic and really wanting to be in person. So that's the other dynamic that I'm seeing. And I saw some young people just saying to me, I'm not happy. I don't feel like they've onboarded me well. And I want to change companies. So that's kind of, I guess, what I saw over the last year up to the present. So now looking at the present and beyond, it's hard to look in your crystal ball and guess what's going to happen, but we see these macro effects, right? Ukraine, big question mark, a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen there. I'm actually going to a webinar tomorrow, being put on by McKinsey to try to start to understand what some of the ripple effects are that we're going to see there. Inflationary pressures might cause companies ultimately to decide to hire less people. But with the great reshuffling taking place, I think there's this counterbalance where I just think that companies are going to continue to need to hire. There's supply chain shortages affecting the market. We have an immigration issue. So the immigration issue is that we have the demand for high skill jobs, especially all of you who are working in technology right now. There's a lack of workers to fill those high skill jobs. And immigration is arguably too slow, especially from India and China. We have 2,000 applicants for visas every year and only 85,000 that are granted. So that's a huge thing. And demographic shifts. I mean, this is really a longer term impact, but during the Great Recession, people had less babies. We also saw less babies happening during the pandemic. So the children that were born during the Great Recession, as that generation starts to segue into the workforce, there's going to be an even greater shortage of labor. And that, frankly, is going to work in all of our favor as workers. And it's going to be harder for those companies that are trying to staff. So that's sort of what I'm seeing. And so what does this mean for all of us? What I think it means is that great companies who treat people well and offer flexible work arrangements are going to engage and retain them. And then poor companies who don't invest in a positive culture, right? Don't root out those bad leaders and don't offer flexible work arrangements are going to be in a constant game of catch up, trying to hire people to replace the ones who leave. So all that stuff that you learned about leadership when you were at Ross, it's all very true. And it's going to be very pertinent. And with social media, it's going to be real obvious who the good companies are and who the companies are that are not that great. So at this point, I think I'm going to pause and we'll start taking some questions. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to explain to our audience that as part of the registration, we asked if you would like to submit questions in advance for our guest speaker, Lisa, and we will go into a few of those questions now. And so, Lisa, as you've covered how the job search has changed both during the pandemic and beyond, what trends do you see in hiring, specifically in office only, hybrid in office and remote only positions? If you could speak to that.
Yes. So this is huge right now. Like I was talking about earlier, there's great pressure on companies to offer remote and hybrid, positions, right? And in certain sectors, it's going to be nearly impossible. We were talking about this, Rajiv, ahead of time, like in manufacturing. In a lot of settings, people have got to be there, and you don't want to create this sort of two class system where you have the people who have to be in person versus the people who can be 100% remote. So I think in manufacturing and other settings, you'll see more of a hybrid situation for a lot of folks. But I'm also seeing more and more companies offering remote, especially in some of the tech companies. And yeah, and I think there's going to be great pressure. Like I just heard of somebody the other day who said, yeah, everybody on my tech team, my technology team is leaving because our company has told them that they need to come back and be in person. And they can just literally, find a job so easily and go work remotely. So yeah, I think I think it's just going to be a continued trend. We're expecting it, and companies are going to need to adapt, and those that don't are going to be less competitive.
Thank you, Lisa. In relation to that, how could one navigate remote working type of questions during the recruitment process? And this could probably apply to both on the recruiter side and the interviewer side. If you could speak to that for our audience today.
That's a great question too. I think, the general philosophy is when you're in the interview process, you want to not say anything or ask anything that might endanger your candidacy. And you want to wait till their interest in you is piqued. Usually that's at the point of the offer. So this is conventional wisdom. And then when you're at the point of the offer, then you kind of pull out your cards. Now, I know that that's problematic and for some people, and some people would prefer not to do that. They just want to be straight up front and not mess around. So you obviously have that option. You just need to know that it could take you out of the running before you even have a chance to prove your worth. So the other thing to do, obviously, is to try to research the company and find out ahead of time, whether through networking or just social media or their website, try to get a sense for how flexible they are. Go to Glassdoor, see what's being said, that sort of thing.
Thank you. We will also be sure to open up and get to everyone's questions towards the end. So if we haven't gotten a chance to get to your question yet, please hang on. In the Q&A feature, you can also upvote questions so that they rise to the top and we will know what are our most popular questions this evening. I have one more question. In the
Yeah.
career resources available that you explained, we had a couple people who have looked at those resources, and the link is in the chat for further exploration for our attendees when they can. But could you speak a little bit to the best tools you're seeing right now, whether LinkedIn, Indeed, or different tools that are kind of coming into the light?
Yeah. And you mean probably specifically for finding job postings, right?
Yes.
So LinkedIn
Yes.
is phenomenal. And some companies have a strategy of just using LinkedIn for posting jobs. And Indeed would be my other top choice overall because it's a meta website, right? That pulls from different websites. I think in general, and Google, I mean, you can Google. I've had great success just by Googling using search terms of things I'm looking up. And then the sites will pop up. And usually what I do find though is that you often want to then go to the company website and make sure that the posting is still live, because I'm finding that there's a lag sometimes between what's posted on the search sites and what the companies actually have posted on their websites. I've had that happen multiple times. So that would be my only caution.
Great advice. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we're ready to, to keep going, and then we'll pause again in a little bit and we'll take more questions. All right. So other job search trends and challenges. So, sunglasses here, glasses here. In general, I feel like the future's so bright, I got to wear shades. And, at the same time, there are some people who are still struggling. I mean, I am working with people who are, I would classify in the long-term unemployed, right? The year or longer. And there are usually reasons for that. And so I really, I feel for those folks, and I understand what those reasons are. This can include things like having gaps on your resume. We know that the applicant tracking systems will automatically screen out people who have more than 6 months of, a gap on the resume. So you really, that can be a tough thing. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is structural age discrimination. The fact that the farther you are in your career, sometimes the harder it can be to convince an HR person or recruiter that, you want to make a pivot or that you're qualified for a certain role. It can be a tough conversation because they often think, oh, why would you be interested in this role when you're this far in your career, especially if you're a career changer or you're re-entering the workforce. So those are some of the things that people struggle with. Changing industry or function can be very challenging. And that's why, you and I probably need to talk, if that's your goal, and talk about what's the best approach for you. For instance, I just talked to somebody the other day who's interested in going from for-profit to nonprofit. And we talked about her trying to get on boards, right? Trying to get on boards is a way to showcase her abilities to the nonprofit, her nonprofit stakeholders. Then there's job title dilemmas, going from small to big or big to small. I'm sure that a number of you can relate to this. If you're in a startup right now and you've got a big title like a VP or a director or a C-suite title, and now you decided, oh my gosh, that startup is too chaotic, right? Which they often are. And you now want to go work in a more stable, larger company. You got a dilemma where you have this really high level title on your resume, but the equivalent position in this big company, or the one that you'd be qualified for based on the scale that you've dealt at, right, in a very small startup, is a real low level position. So you've got to really calibrate that job title according to your target. So I'm talking to a lot of folks about that. Now, the other dilemma is going from big to small. So then we've got people working for the giant, Fortune 5 or Fortune 10 who have huge scale, right? $1 billion+ projects they're dealing with, but their job title is something really low. And clearly they'd be qualified to take a pretty high level position at a small and medium-sized company. But now you've got to figure out how to communicate to your audience that you're qualified for that. So that these are the kinds of things that I'm talking to people about one-on-one, and we're figuring out strategy. So besides all that, the other thing I would bring up is applicant tracking systems as a trend that I think everybody just needs to be aware of. I'm a big fan, like all the people who do the work that I do, we believe that networking is the right thing to do. I'm a big proponent of the 2-hour job search, which talks about the networking strategy, right? I've shared that with a lot of you. But if you want to play the game of applying to jobs online, even though the odds are low, it's very tempting to want to apply to jobs online, and sometimes you have to do it. Then you want to understand what you're dealing with applicant tracking systems. So I want to just speak to that for a couple minutes here. So what are these things? This is the software that companies use to collect resumes and screen them so that, when they put a posting out there on LinkedIn or Indeed or on their website and they get 200 resumes, they can whittle that number down to about 20 that a human reader will actually look at. So that's the job of the applicant tracking system. They are part of the strategy for 98 to 99% of Fortune 500 companies. So you're going to be dealing with it no matter what. The top 5, I understand, are Workday, Talio, SuccessFactors, BrassRing, and ICIMS. They're all a little bit different. And so your goal is to not get screened out, to actually get to a human reader. So how do you do that? Well, here's some tips. You want to, first of all, tailor your resume to the job description. I always tell people job title is king or queen on your resume. So what is the job title on the job posting that you're applying to? Can you incorporate that job title somewhere on your resume or get as close to it as you can while still being truthful? The dilemma that a lot of people have is that their job title is not descriptive of what they actually do. Like, for instance, a lot of people are out there doing product management, but a lot of companies don't use that term. So how can you incorporate product management somewhere on your resume so it gets picked up by the ATS? So that's number 1. Number 2, besides job title, what are the skills that the job posting is looking for? You've got to really analyze those job postings and incorporate those skills somewhere on your resume. If you're using a 2-page resume, if you graduated to the 2-page resume, you'll have space at the top for that summary and keyword section. You can incorporate those keywords there. Of course, they have to be things that you've actually done. You can't just lie on your resume, right? So that's huge. Just a few other tips here then. You want to use the acronyms and potentially also the long forms of terms in case the companies are using one or the other in their search criteria. You want to use a chronological resume. So sometimes it's tempting to use a functional format, but truly nobody likes a functional resume. So use a reverse chronological order resume because that's what the programs are used to reading things in a certain order. So you don't want to mess with that. Use a standard resume section headings like work experience or experience versus, kind of cute terms like where I've been, because it won't recognize where I've been. It's looking for the label and it's looking for the information below the label. Don't use tables or boxes. So like a simple stacking of information is best. So tables and boxes, the problem is if it's reading across, it might parse the information wrong. So it's just unreadable. And then your resume will get rejected. Use a common font. So I'm not a big fan of Times New Roman, which I've told some of you because it's kind of considered old school, but something like Arial, Garamond, and Calibri, where there won't be any font substitution issues in dealing with an ATS. So, a docx form or a PDF is preferred. I'm told that a docx is best, but if you want to do PDF, that's probably going to be okay, especially if you can sweep over the resume and highlight the whole thing, then chances are the ATS is going to be able to pick it up. And finally here, you can use a free version of software like Jobscan to compare your resume to the posting. Okay, so just, kind of a slick thing to do just to give you some information on how you stack up. So here's a scan that I did on Jobscan on my resume, comparing it to a listing from Korn Ferry for something that I thought was like an exact match to my background, right? It was a career coach and leadership coach. That's exactly what I do. And I came out initially at like 40%. And I thought, that's interesting. So what it did was it gave me that figure and then it gave me some suggestions on what I could do to up that, right? And granted, this is just software, right? It's not perfect. So there's some garbage in there, but it's just interesting. And I think, if you can do it for free, 5 free scans, it might be worth it for some of you to try this out and just, see how it goes for you, right? All you have to do is grab you'll see when you go in there, but all you have to do is grab all your resume content, paste it into one box, grab the job posting content, paste it into the other box, and then it'll give you a percentage match. And it'll give you some tips for how to improve your ranking. And then for about, I think $75 or so, you can get 3 months with Jobscan. It'll give you unlimited scans and also some LinkedIn intelligence as well. So that's pretty valuable too. And I'm not getting paid by Jobscan at all, by the way. And as I say that, let me just give my big caveat. Jobscan says that the people who use their software get 3 times the number of interviews. And I would say 3 times the number of interviews isn't necessarily 3 times the number of job offers. So don't forget that people who network into opportunities always have an advantage. I mean, you're bypassing the gatekeeper here, the electronic gatekeeper. You're going right to the hiring manager oftentimes. And people who've networked in disproportionately get invited to later stages of interviews. So I just want to make sure that we don't fool ourselves that just using software like this is like the golden ticket. All right, so starting to sort of summarize what I have to share here. Be strategic. Be strategic in this market right now. You want to shop companies' cultures and leadership teams versus just roles. You can afford to do that because it's a seller's market right now in job search, right? The other thing is you want to protect your brand. If possible, avoid multiple gaps on your resume. I know that some of you are really struggling and you're working in toxic work environments. If possible, try to take a leave of absence, and then take that leave of absence and use it to focus on your search so that you can extend that employment date and try to avoid the gaps if possible. One gap is one thing, but having multiple gaps. The other thing is, I know that many people are changing jobs more frequently now, especially in tech. I mean, it's kind of become the way that things are. But when I look at a resume where I see people with 6 months here, 10 months there, a year and a half there, you got to realize that hiring managers and recruiters are going to be concerned about that because hiring is a pain, it's expensive, and companies don't want to do it all the time. So really try to land those jobs where you're going to be able to stay for at least a few years. Really, really try to do that. The other thing I've got on here is to get ahead of changes in the market. So I'm working with a couple of people right now. One of them is, a couple of folks who are in asset management. And what's happened with, like, for instance, the emergence of exchange traded funds, the ETFs, that the number of asset managers that are needed overall has shrunk. So if you see that happening in your industry, if you see those structural changes taking place, you got to get ahead of that curve and try to start to make your pivots now. Another example of that would be like transmission managers. With the move to electric vehicles, there's going to be a much lower need for, traditional engine, powertrain engineers. So if you're in that space, try to pivot over to EV as soon as you can. All right, I'm almost done, Kathy. So going on, consider the narrative that you're building with each move. Look at your resume like a recruiter or a hiring manager would look at it. What's the story that your moves, all your moves tell? Is it cohesive, or does it feel like you're all over the place? That's where it gets to be a challenge. So you want to build that easy to follow story in terms of job title and industry. To change careers, often you're going to want to pivot in company first, especially as you grow in your career. It's going to be much easier to rebrand in company and then jump externally. And finally, if you want to get if you want to change industry, you might want to try to get into consulting where you can get multi-industry experience and then jump off from there into your new industry. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. I've talked a lot, and see what other questions we have, Kathy.
Yes, thank you so much. These are really great recommendations and a lot to take in. So I wanted to remind our audience that we are recording today's session. And we do have a couple more questions that were submitted in advance that follow along with the recommendations you've listed just recently. So for maybe attendees that are on who recently graduated, could you speak a little bit to how they could possibly market a job switch or position themselves for the next step or phase in their career?
Yeah, so interesting question. Yeah, I think I'd like to talk one-on-one with whoever submitted that. But in general, my advice on that would be, it all depends on your target. So where do you want to go from here? So how you position yourself is always based on what your next goal is. So really think through that, and then start to, the closer, like I said, job title is king or queen on your resume and on LinkedIn. So the closer you can get to whatever your target job title is on your branding, the better off you are.
Thank you so much. Are there ways that candidates can be proactive to mitigate unconscious bias in the recruitment and interview process?
Yeah, that is another really powerful question. I've seen people, for instance, on LinkedIn, I've seen people not show their photo as a way to try to, you know, inoculate against unconscious bias. And the issue with that is that I think that the photo is so important, right? It feels like there's something missing when I don't see it. So I'm not wild about that, although I can certainly understand why people would want to do it. And I would, honor anybody's choice to do that. The other thing that I would say about that, I mean, it's so tough, right? It's tough to control for unconscious bias. And you kind of get into this conversation of code switching, right? Trying to speak the language of your target. And I know that sometimes that can feel inauthentic to people, but I do know that people who are in that situation often make that choice to code switch, right? To try to speak the language, to act like the people that they want to get a job with. But in general, I feel like the best protection against unconscious bias is just to be a great candidate, to have great branded materials, a great pitch, to really focus on the posting and be able to speak to the things that the company is looking for. And when you can do that, regardless of what you look like or how many years of experience you have, you're going to stand out from the pack.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions coming in through chat and Q&A, and we will get to those momentarily, but we thank you for being very engaged this evening. It's a great conversation.
Great.
Yeah. So we have, thank you, Lisa. This was fantastic and just a lot of good advice here. We do have 15 minutes or so remaining, and we wanted to use this time to really have an interactive dialogue here. So feel free, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. You can upvote questions that have been asked already that you can see. And you can also make observations in your chat window. We'll be monitoring those and answering those as they come in. While we wait for folks to type up some more questions here, I wanted to, Lisa, take us back to a little bit of some of the advice that you've given is evergreen, a classic advice. But in the current times, when we have this hybrid remote we talked about, right? We talked about, we didn't use the word, but the great resignation, right, that we are going through. Some of these massive upheavals that are going on in the job market, both in terms of the demand-supply ratio, in the employer expectations, the culture around job searches. So we have what perhaps could be argued as a major reset in the norms of how job searches should be conducted and how employers look for candidates and how candidates position themselves. So in looking at that broader picture, I wanted to get your thoughts on the risks and opportunities that are presented in this upheaval kind of environment. And as an example, the great resignation, does certainly make the demand-supply ratio favorable to the candidates, right? There are more jobs than candidates. But on the other hand, perhaps the employers are getting more, anxious about job hoppers. So does that hurt? Do you see them more anxious about looking for loyalty or sense of commitment from the candidates? And so that being an example, I just was wondering if you have any additional color to offer on some of what we just talked about.
Yeah. So let me make sure I'm clear on the question. So on the one hand, we know that there's many more job postings available now. We see people getting multiple offers. And you were saying, is there more anxiety on the part of employers about loyalty?
Mhm.
about people sticking around. Is
Yes,
that
that's
correct? Is that how you would phrase that? So what I see is, that's a great question. I mean, I'm thinking about that to see if I can really, I guess from my vantage point, what I see is the dilemma of people having multiple offers and trying to time those offers. So that's the biggie. And people, like, what do I do? Like, the company that's my number 2 on my list has made me an offer and they've only given me a week to respond, or they've only given me a few days to respond, but I'm waiting for my, number 1 company to make me an offer for me to get all the way through the interview process. So yeah, that's really tough. And I think that at this point, companies don't know if people are actually going to start. Like, that's the big challenge, because they'll go ahead and accept, because, if you're up against a deadline, what are you going to do? You got to kind of accept the offer, right? You can try to put it off, but ultimately you have to accept. But then you're letting the other company know, hey, I've got another offer on the table. Can we accelerate this process so that I can make the right decision for me and my family? So that's usually what I'm telling people. You've got to make the right decision for you and your family. And so then they're, let's say they're accepting with their number 2 company on the list, and then they're finally getting through the process with company number 1, and then they may actually end up declining company number 2. So that's a worry that a lot of companies have right now is this person actually going to start? And more they're experiencing people not actually starting. So you have to realize that if you do that, you've burned a bridge with that company. I mean, it just kind of is what it is, but that's the current reality with the job market.
Another example of the upheaval and the renorming, so to speak, of the job search process is the question of gaps that you alluded to. And I see some questions related to that as well. Now, it has always been true that gaps are not good, and you need to have a narrative around those gaps, and the length of the gaps matter. Is it time to recalibrate what does a gap mean at this time? Just given the favorable demand supply ratio and the fact that people are switching and opting out, do you see the gap become less of an issue? Or is it just the same as before? People like to see a continuous employment.
Right. I would say overall, the gap is less of an issue. It's more of an issue with these applicant tracking systems. I mean, that's where, you can't control the software, right? And that, again, that's why, anytime you can network, it's better, because you can tell your story, right? You can tell your story. The person who's referred you can say, hey, this is a good candidate. They got a buyout, they took some time off, but really, there's nothing wrong with them, right? They now are ready to get back in. So I've seen many people with gaps on their resume come out of that and get good jobs. I'm seeing it particularly lately because there's such a demand in the market.
I see.
Yep.
One of the questions participants asked this question: should we include the graduation date, and should we only include recent experiences? Because if companies might assume you're an older candidate if you do not include the graduation date, assuming it's far enough in the past.
Yes. So I think that there is such a thing as a fresh MBA. And so I think graduation date is good to include with your degrees for the first 5 to 10 years post-graduation-ish. And the reason why I'm hedging is because I think that it always depends on your target, and it always depends on who you're, that's really the driver for everything, is what is your target. And so, but I do recommend that once somebody is out about 15 years, that they drop their graduation date off. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's generally, you just don't want it to be a distraction. You don't want them doing mental math. And I do think it's fine to drop early employment, to start to drop early employment off your resume, if possible. I have that dilemma where I worked for a company for the first 14 years of my career. So I either have to completely drop that company off, or reveal my age. But yeah, that's what I would say. I think that, and the conventional wisdom is you really only need to show the last 10 to 12 years of your experience. That's what employers are most interested in. But honestly, I think it depends. You really have to look at what some people have phenomenal early career experience. You don't have to keep every bullet for that early experience, but you can keep job titles and company names. So I hate to say it depends, but it depends. And I like to have a one-on-one conversation with people to work that out.
Sounds good. And I was hoping to pin you down to like 10 years or 15 years or 20.
Right. I know. I would love to do that, but I know better. And I would say that people who do my work, who are executive career coaches, they'll say the same thing. You want to avoid, we have rules, we have guidelines, we have things we recommend, but it all depends on your target and your situation.
Okay. And while on the topic of age, etc., a question came in asking, how is the job market for 50 plus workers? Do you have any comments about that?
Yep. So I think that it's, like I was saying earlier, it's hard to pivot when you get to a certain point. When I say pivot, I mean changing function in industry. If you're staying in industry and staying in function, I think you're good. But if you're wanting to pivot, you have to be strategic about it. Because I mean, a lot of it too, Rajiv, is level. So once you've reached 50, some people are at a director level or higher. And so you can't make up, one, there's less jobs at the high level because companies are pyramids, right? So that makes it harder. And two, if you're a director level in one industry or function, and you want to pivot to a different industry or function, it's hard to do that at the director level. Like you usually have to take a step down. And that...
Sorry, the question wasn't about switching careers after 50, but just the general job market.
Yeah.
Because I see the reason I suspect the question is coming from, industry, at least the tech industry that I'm familiar with. There is a certain amount of attrition at the higher ages that we see.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you can have any general comments about that dynamic.
Yeah. So I see people overall who are 50 and older doing really well in the market. I think it helps that it's a good market right now. And it helps when you are, like I said, really speaking, paying attention to your branding, your interviewability, networking, doing all those things. When that's the case, people are looking right past whatever your age is, your wrinkles, your gray hair, whatever it is, they're looking right past that and seeing you as the top candidate for the position. But there are things that make that more difficult. And those are the things that I was speaking to earlier.
Good. A couple more themes in the questions that I'm seeing live. One is, let me get this one quick question out of the way. Are there tools besides Glassdoor for guidance on estimating a compensation range for a potential new role?
Yeah, there's also PayScale, which is pretty good. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. The other thing that I like to refer people to sometimes is 81 cents. And there's another tool out there too that I can't off the top of my head think of, but there's a product or a little company out there called 81 cents. That's a reference to how much women make on the dollar for every man. But for a pretty small fee, like let's say it's $200, it's not huge. They'll actually do extensive salary research for you and give you a figure of your value in the market, which you then can combine with other data, such as from Glassdoor or from even the Ross employment report. And you can combine that and then present that during your negotiations with a target company. Mm-hmm. But yeah, go ahead and that person can go ahead and email me offline, and then I'll try to see if I can get the name of that other tool too.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. I see some questions related to immigration, and so one question says that he gets contacted many times for leadership roles, but with my current immigration status, the conversation ends right there. Is there a different way you would suggest we navigate around this question? And I think there's some other questions about, you have looking for career switchers in tech. There's some resistance to that. As you mentioned, it's harder to switch careers after a certain age. But then there is also demand for foreign workers to fill these tech jobs. So I was wondering if you can share some commentary on those two related topics.
Yeah. So starting with, and I just feel for people, right, who are in that situation, that immigration status situation. It is so hard. And like I think I said earlier, I quoted the number of people who apply for those visas versus the number that are granted every year. And there's a huge backup with India and China. So it's very hard. And when I see people getting that green card, I mean, it is so freeing. They're no longer tied to those companies that they're tied for that H-1B visa. So, but in terms of wanting a leadership role, it's a really tough question. I mean, I think that if it's a company that that you can form a relationship with over time, and you can get that company to apply to, basically apply for that visa for that particular role. I think that might be a way around it, but I know that's sort of a long shot, and companies want to save those visas usually for those STEM jobs. So that's the one thing I can think of there. But yeah, I'm happy to have that conversation offline with that person as well. I'll share my email address in just a minute.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lisa. And in the interest of time, I know there's a few questions here that are of a very specific nature. We'll record those and get back to you either directly or in some other fashion here. But Lisa, in case people have questions, I think, would you say a good way is to just reach out to you one-on-one, and start with that, and you can further guide them at that point?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to do that.
Sounds good. With that, I'd like to probably wrap it up at this time. And really, really big shout of thanks here to Lisa for spending time and, just sharing very candidly and in a very comprehensive manner here what's going on with the job search in today's climate. And to Catherine, without whose help we could not have put this event together. Fantastic job, Catherine. It's a pleasure working with you, pulling this together. And thanks to both of you. There's a few words here. Lisa, do you want to, wrap up some of the comments that you make here? What do you want to leave everybody with here?
Absolutely. Glad to do it. Thanks, Rajiv. Yeah. So I guess if I'm going to share some final words of advice, they would be, networking is still the best approach. And, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is now. So, think very long term about the relationships that you build and the relationships you form even with people at work, because usually those former colleagues are the best referral sources for you, as well as your former classmates. So yeah, happy to talk more about that with you one-on-one. And then the second thing is do a company search instead of a job search, right? You want to really find those great companies. And because, really great companies, regardless of what the initial job is that you might take with them, you should have the opportunity to pivot and have, an even greater career trajectory post joining that company. So yeah, that's really my mantra. And then finally, use the resources that are available to you. You can feel free to email me at rossalumniccareers@umich.edu or Lisa Morg@umich.edu, the first 8 letters of my name. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Kathy to wrap us up.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Rajiv, and thank you to all of our attendees. We hope that you enjoyed this evening's session.